Hello and welcome to Cutting Through. I'm Mitchell Plitnick. We got today the proposed text of the 28-point plan that Donald Trump is proposing to end the war between Russia and Ukraine. And I have to say, surprisingly, there are some aspects of it that are really positive. Unsurprisingly, there are other aspects that are deeply problematic, and all of it was developed in consultation with Russia and without Ukraine, which is the wrong way to develop these things. And that I think makes it harder for the good points to be built on and for the problematic points to be addressed. Nonetheless, it's a better document than I expected, I have to say. Um, Even though the lack of Ukrainian participation, I think, is reflected in some of the provisions. I mean, the biggest problem is what's going to be a problem for frankly, any accord that's reached. The idea that there's going to be an agreement for Russia to withdraw from all of the territory that it has taken illegally from Ukraine is simply not realistic. It hasn't been realistic really from the beginning. Um, Certainly has not been realistic for most of this war. Any uh, any diplomatic resolution is going to reflect change borders that are illegal, and it sets a precedent, a terrible precedent, because it's a precedent that brings us back to, the first half of the 20th century and everything before that, when states basically just grabbed what territory they could because might made right. And that is the world we're moving towards now. And it's a terrible world. The idea that sovereign borders mean nothing doesn't work if you have a system of states. Now, I'm perfectly happy to work for a world that abolishes all borders, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about, one state expanding its own borders at the expense of another. Um, I would love to see a border-free world. I would love to see a world free of nation states. And, I can list my fantasies forever, but it's not the world we live in. And in this world, the idea that we're going back to a place where the use of force turns the acquisition of territory into a fait accompli, there really isn't anything Ukraine can do to get this back. The only alternative is for the West, NATO, almost entirely, including Europe and the United States, and probably some other countries as well, to come together and fight a war against Russia. That's the only way that that happens, and that's World War III. So with that threat, um, there was never any way that Ukraine was going to re retake all of that territory. But making this more difficult for Ukrainians and Volodymyr Zelensky to accept, this proposal also demands that Ukraine acknowledge the loss of the entire Donbas region, including giving up the 14% of that region that it still controls. So Russia would get all of that. Um, Again, the argument against that is obvious. It is, rewarding the use of force and rewarding a war of aggression that Russia launched in 2022, um, and showing that works. Well, I'm going to get to the flip side of that, but part of this agreement is that the world would recognize Russian sovereignty over the Donbass. Um, and Even though Ukraine would not be expected to. Um, and depending on how you want to read this and how this comes out, it would also acknowledge what is, again, not something that's ever likely to be reversed regardless, which is Russia's control of Crimea. Um, there's there's a difference, however, between recognizing that there really isn't much you can do about it and acknowledging Russia's sovereignty over those territories. You are saying that you're giving the global imprimatur to to Russia's theft of Ukrainian land. Now, Ukraine's not expected to share in this recognition, but what does that mean? You know, Outside of the fact that no one's asking Ukraine to recognize Russian sovereignty over there, It means the only thing it really means is that lack of recognition could possibly lead to renewed conflict down the road. It doesn't really do Ukraine any good. Yes, it avoids a certain humiliation, but in practice, and I think most Ukrainians will not, consider that it's all that big a deal, and certainly Zelensky won't. But that's what's being proposed. On top of that, the plan is imposing strict limits on the size of the Ukrainian military, although that limit is 600,000, which is smaller than the Ukrainian military is now, but considerably larger than it was before the invasion. So I guess you can, do with that what you will. And also says that Ukraine will not buy or develop long-range missiles. And, having Ukraine being restricted in this way when they were the ones that were invaded. I mean, this is, kind of the same thing as similar in this sense to the Gaza plan, where the people who were the victims of the aggression are forced to make the concessions. Uh, it's clearly unfair. It's clearly unjust. Um, it is also, something that Ukraine may be being forced to accept right now. The fact that Zelensky has already indicated that he is willing to discuss this plan with Trump, and he won't, and he hasn't rejected it outright, I think shows the amount of pressure that's being brought to bear on him. And it's real. I mean, and part of that pressure is not even coming from Washington. Part of that pressure is simply coming from the fact that this war is getting close to entering, its fifth year. And Ukraine bears the brunt of that. We can talk about, we can throw numbers around and that more Russian soldiers have been killed than Ukrainian soldiers, et cetera, et cetera. We can throw those numbers around, and that's great. But the reality is that most of the fighting, almost all of it, not all, but almost all of it has taken place on Ukrainian territory. It's Ukraine that's been destroyed. It's Ukraine that has seen, so many of its own people flee the country because they're fleeing the war. Ukraine has suffered the brunt of this, and that's I think Zelensky can't ignore the fact that that there is an opportunity perhaps to bring this to an end if he can, find an acceptable deal. Um, the draft addresses the question of Ukraine's membership in NATO, and bars that. And in fact, commits to ending NATO expansion, which personally I don't think is a bad idea. I think, NATO is an antiquated uh, 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 institution that should have gone the way of the dodo and the Cold War. But it's there. It's probably not going anywhere. It also, but in conjunction with that, it does stipulate that Russia will agree that Ukraine can become a full member of the EU, and in fact recommends that process be prioritized. So there's something there. I think one thing that's going to be particularly galling for Ukrainian nationalists and Ukrainian, frankly, patriots, is that the draft calls for designating Russian as a second official language in Ukraine. Now, in a different context, that may be a good idea and even understandable. There's many Russian speakers in Ukraine who are Ukrainians, and those Russian speakers have, since Russia's aggression started, for the most part, sided heavily with Ukraine. But they're still Russian speakers, and there's still a cultural attachment there that is important to those folks. And the fact that Russia has frequently used that as propaganda leverage, I think doesn't change the fact that it wouldn't kill. And then again, in a normal circumstance, and outside of this war, it wouldn't have killed Ukraine to make that designation, considering how many Russian speakers are in the country. Under these circumstances, I think it's very humiliating, and it's in my view, it's a bad idea, although it's probably a big selling point to getting Russian hardliners to, at least be receptive to discussing the idea. And I suspect that's why it was put in there. Um, the key point, and it's been the point that we've been discussing since this war began, is how Ukraine can feel comfortable that Russia will not attack it again if there is a settlement. And quite frankly, Trump has stepped forward with something that is way, way beyond anything that he or his predecessor Joe Biden had done before in terms of the security guarantees. Now, the guarantees are left very vague in the actual 28-point plan, which we're going to go through point by point in a bit. But just before I recorded this, there was a report from Axios that cited officials in the Trump administration saying, saying that there is a separate sort of annex that describes exactly what reliable securities guarantees, which is the wording in the plan, exactly what that means. It's basically a sister agreement that Trump is attaching, and if it sticks, it's about as close to a NATO-like commitment as you can get without actually having Ukraine join NATO. It states that, and I'm quoting Axios here. It states that any future significant, deliberate, and sustained armed attack by Russia on Ukraine would be regarded as an attack threatening the peace and security of the transatlantic community, and the U.S. and its allies will respond accordingly, including through military force. So it's not quite NATO, like if Russia launched an isolated attack for some reason, it wouldn't necessarily trigger this, but an invasion absolutely would trigger a potentially a military response. This is pretty much as close to the wording of NATO's Article 5. So now this is significant. This is a significant thing. It's unclear to me that Russia actually is okay with this. The report did not make clear that this sister agreement was worked out with Russia's knowledge. So we're going to see where that goes and whether or not Russia actually accepts this. But if this is really part of the agreement, it does make it a lot better. Still, it's not a good deal for Ukraine, but I think one of the problems is, and this has to be acknowledged, there is no winning this war for Ukraine. There hasn't been pretty much ever. In fact, the goal of this war when Russia launched it was to basically topple the government in Kyiv and turn Ukraine back into the rump state basically under full Russia de facto control that it had been before. And that plan has failed. That's where Ukraine's victory lies. And the fact that that this war has continued has only been bad from that point, from the point at which Ukraine fought the initial aggression off. This has been a losing proposition for Kyiv. Hasn't gone great for Moscow either. Let's be very clear. This is, since that point, it's been more or less a lose-lose. But it has. Again, as I said, at the outset, this war is fought on Ukrainian ground. Russia isn't suffering the damage to infrastructure. Of course, it's losing many of its young people, many of its soldiers. But it hasn't suffered the damage to its infrastructure, and certainly the impact on civilians hasn't been anything like what it has been in Ukraine. That's important. I mean, when this war initially began, and it was funny because when it initially began, it looked like there was a good chance that Russia would succeed in toppling the Kyiv government. And the Ukrainians fought back and stopped that from happening. And, a few months into the war, there was a high-level meeting including the Ukrainian and Russian leaders, in Istanbul. And there was a peace proposal that Ukraine was considering, and they were considering it strongly enough that Boris Johnson, with the full buy-in and cooperation of Joe Biden at the time, went to Istanbul to convince Zelensky not to take it. There were other reasons besides Ukraine's best interests that the West wanted to see this war happen. And, in fact, the Secretary of Defense at the time, Lloyd Austin, made it clear it was to degrade Russia's military capabilities. It was to get Russia dragged into a long, drawn-out war that would weaken it militarily, which has more or less, succeeded. It has had the kinds of impact that Austin was thinking of, but it has certainly not been good for Ukraine. The rejection of that offer and that agreement, almost 4 years ago, has been a disaster for Ukraine, and it is not a mistake that they can afford to make again. If they do, they really do run the risk of ultimately Russia coming out victorious, not because they'll have, really, they'll have possibly toppled the Kyiv government, but only because they will just have beaten it into exhaustion. And this draft does have Russia legally recognizing Ukraine's independence within the new borders. Look, none of this is great. It is not. It's a bad situation, but it's a worse situation than it would have been had Ukraine uh, followed Zelensky's initial inclinations and reached an agreement once Russia was chastised by having their advance that they expected to be in Kyiv in a matter of days or weeks, and when that advance was halted by Ukraine, and remember, Ukraine did this at that time with minimal help from the West. Ukraine did this themselves, and as a result, thwarted the basic core of Russia's plan. And had they been satisfied um, to take that and end the war there, and give up on the idea, particularly of getting Crimea back, but also give up on the idea of listening to Boris Johnson and Joe Biden and fighting a war for the West that was not in Ukraine's best interests, you know, they would not be in the position they're in today, where they're going to lose more territory and have to make greater compromises than they would have then. Um, Beyond this security guarantee, there are real carrots, and we're going to see this. I'm about to go through the 28 points quickly. I won't take up too much of your time. But there are significant carrots that are in this that could, in combination with these security guarantees, prevent, or at least theoretically prevent renewed Russian aggression. So let's look at what the 28 points are. So the first one is that Ukraine's sovereignty would be confirmed. So basically, everyone, including Russia, recognizes Ukraine as a sovereign state. Um, Obviously, it'll be within these new borders, which isn't great, but that is a clear declaration from Moscow that I think is necessary. Um, Point two. A comprehensive non-aggression agreement will be concluded between Russia, Ukraine, and Europe. All ambiguities of the last 30 years will be considered settled. This is one of those Trumpian sort of broad statements that really needs to be fleshed out as to what this means. Ukraine's independence, happened, more than 30 years ago. And it came into question only later on, the beginning of this century. And that was because Russia was uncomfortable with having lost Ukraine. Ukraine's independence came as a result of various agreements. It was actually part of the whole collapse of the Soviet Union, but it was initiated even before that. It's a longer story than I'm going to go into here, but and the aggravation of NATO's eastward expansion against the promises of the 1990s that were given to Moscow uh, helped to create this again. And I want to be really clear, that does not in any way justify Russia's behavior. Russia's behavior has been criminal. NATO expansion, though it was a broken promise, was not criminal. Um, it was something NATO could choose to do. Point three is that it is expected that Russia will not invade neighboring countries and NATO will not expand further. So you have uh, you have here the commitment to stop NATO expansion. I mean, at this point, outside of Ukraine, there isn't much point to NATO expansion, frankly. And at least in terms of Russia, and of course, Russia's commitment to not invade neighboring countries is not only Ukraine. It has some other small states and as well as EU states um, that could fall under that rubric. But that's where the commitment, to ending NATO expansion comes. Now, this will immediately set off people thinking, well, how can we? Yeah, okay, so Russia says so, but what makes them? Well, again, the carrots that will come later, as well as the fact that pretty much the whole framework here is that this was the last time the West would sit idly by and let Russia do something like that. That's kind of the implied threat in a lot of this. How real that is, who knows? Obviously that's the kind of thing that the proof of the pudding is in the eating. And when push came to shove, Joe Biden talked for years. For years talked tough about Russia, but would only help Ukraine fight a battle that it could never win. And that's a defensible position because potentially that leads to World War III if the United States gets more directly involved. Nonetheless, this seems to be what Trump's proposing be the threat to Russia. The fourth point is that a dialogue will be held between Russia, NATO, and mediated by the U.S. to remove security issues and create conditions for de-escalation in order to ensure global security, increase opportunities for cooperation and economic development, blah, blah, blah. Again, this is a rather meaningless point. It doesn't really mean much of anything, except that there's a lot in here about basically reintegrating Russia to the international community, in which case there's always going to be these kinds of dialogues that are talked about in this point. Point five is the reliable security guarantees for Ukraine, which I've talked about. The that's all it says here is that Ukraine will receive reliable security guarantees. So we still need to see all that I spoke of is in this accompanying document. Whether or not that's actually going to be part of this deal still remains to be seen. And if it's not, I don't think this is worth the paper it's printed on, because how can Ukraine possibly agree without something really solid, that some kind of really solid commitment that the West is going to defend it against Russia if Russia decides to do this again. The limits on the Ukrainian armed forces, limit to 600,000 personnel. Ukraine agrees to point seven we're at now. Ukraine agrees to enshrine in its constitution that it will not join NATO. NATO agrees to include in its statutes a provision that Ukraine will not be admitted in the future. And NATO, point eight, is that NATO agrees not to station troops in Ukraine. And that's a big deal because the UK and I forget who else, another country, that was part of their plan for how to settle this war, is that they would station some troops in Ukraine. This says that will not happen. It does not stipulate that no international force might be stationed in Ukraine, but it wouldn't be a NATO force, which is important. But again, if the security guarantee is worth, it actually becomes part of this agreement, the need for NATO troops is diminished, not eliminated, but it's diminished. Point nine is that European fighter jets will be stationed in Poland. So they're basically telling Moscow that is something you'll have to accept. I don't think Moscow would have a big problem with that. Point 10 is various is conditions on the U.S. security guarantee. And the first point, in typical Trumpian fashion, is that the U.S. will receive compensation for the guarantee. It's not specified what, but it's basically, we're not going to do this for free. We're going to suck a good deal of money out of Ukraine and possibly Russia as well. Point two, if Ukraine invades Russia, it will lose the guarantee. So if Ukraine should attack Russia, which there's no reason in the world for it to do, and there's no reason to think it would ever do, um, all of these security guarantees are forfeit. That makes sense. If Russia invades Ukraine, in addition to a decisive coordinated military response, all global sanctions will be reinstated. Recognition of the new territory and all of the benefits of this deal will be revoked. That is a pretty significant threat. You're basically saying that if Russia attacks Ukraine again, that the recognition of the new borders is out the window, including the recognition of Russia's control of Crimea. There'd be a military response, and sanctions would be reinstated. And those sanctions, we're going to see a bit more about sanctions later on. Um, but if there is significant sanction relief on Russia, and those sanctions are really rolled back, and Russia is really reintegrated into the global economy, that's a big threat. That if those sanctions and what should be done is that those sanctions should not be eliminated; they should be suspended for whatever period of time. You can't do it; it wouldn't be permanent, but there would have to be an extensive period of time that those sanctions would be suspended and would automatically snap back if Russia invades Ukraine. That's a decent deterrent. The last point on the U.S. guarantee is that if Ukraine launches a missile at Moscow or St. Petersburg without cause, the security guarantee will be deemed invalid. So again, more or less just repeating the point it made earlier. Point 11 is that Ukraine is eligible for EU membership and will receive short-term preferential access to the European market while this issue is being considered. So, that would help the Ukrainian economy rebuild itself. It would help a lot in terms of getting Ukrainian natural resources into the European market quickly and easily, and with less cost to Kyiv, and that's important. So, that's a positive. Point 12, a powerful global package of measures to rebuild Ukraine that would include a Ukrainian development fund to bring in, tech industries, data centers, and artificial intelligence, because that is the Trump obsession. So unsurprising that they would want to have good sweetheart business deals that are operating in Ukraine. The U.S. would cooperate with Ukraine to jointly rebuild, develop, modernize, and operate Ukraine's gas infrastructure, including pipelines and storage facilities. And remember, wherever it says the U.S. will cooperate with Ukraine, that means the U.S. partners with Ukraine and takes a good chunk of the profits. Joint efforts to rehabilitate war-affected areas for restoration, reconstruction, and modernization of cities and residential areas. That will, again, involve some U.S. stuff, but more than likely that is where international aid is probably envisioned the most. Infrastructure development as the next point. Extraction of minerals and natural resources. Many of you will probably recall that an agreement between Trump and Zelensky months back about particularly mineral extraction and how big a chunk the United States would take out of that industry in Ukraine has already been reached. So it's talking about institutionalizing and operationalizing that agreement. And again, I mean, this is the highway robbery. Let's be honest. It's Trump basically robbing Ukraine, but the alternative is that the war continues and Ukraine can't use those resources in an optimal way anyway. The final point is that the World Bank would develop a financing package to develop these efforts. Fine. Point 13 is that Russia will be reintegrated into the global economy, and the lifting of sanctions will be discussed and agreed upon in stages and on a case-by-case basis. The U.S. will enter into a long-term economic cooperation agreement for mutual development in the areas of energy, natural resources, infrastructure, artificial intelligence, data centers, rare earth metal extraction projects in the Arctic, and other mutually beneficial corporate opportunities. Trump wants to do business with Russia. That has been a known uh, quantity about this since the 2014 when all of these sanctions were slapped on Russia. Trump has wanted to get around them. We know this. Trump has whatever his business arrangements are. They have enormous potential in Russia. It also says that Russia will be invited to rejoin the G8. Now, again, all of this sounds like rewarding aggression, and I get that, or at least reversing the penalties. But if these things are made conditional on Russia, completely halting its aggression, that is the kind of deterrent that will be effective. So I think we need to look at that. Point 14 is about frozen funds, which I won't go into. It's not a really big deal. I mean, it's of course very important, and particularly as important is that $100 billion of Russian assets would be invested in U.S.-led efforts to rebuild Ukraine. That the U.S. it says explicitly that the U.S. would receive half the profits from that commercial venture. So everything here is about bringing more and more money into the U.S. None of this is being done out of the goodness of anyone's heart, certainly not ours. Point 15 is a joint American-Russia working group on security issues, which would, be kind of a natural thing. And again, I have no issue. In fact, I fully support the idea of of improving U.S.-Russian relations, of improving U.S.-China relations. Easing these conflicts is a good thing. And it is unfortunate that too many people see it as somehow a betrayal of the United States. It's not. It is unfortunate that it means that Russia, again, there will be no accountability. And there's actually a specific point that we'll get to in a bit that says there will be no accountability. But it is a good thing to reintegrate countries into the international community. Carrots are generally more effective than sticks anyway, and the combination of the two is how you deter powerful states from doing something like Russia did to Ukraine. So, I'm for this. In fact, number 16, we'll talk about something that's a little more ceremonial. Russia will enshrine in law its policy of non-aggression toward Europe and Ukraine. I mean, again, cynically, we'll all say, will Russia obey its own law in this regard? And who knows? But that is a thing. It's one way of demonstrating that this will last. It's symbolic, and if that was the only thing that was really keeping Russia in check, it would be a joke. But since we do have these real carrots and real sticks, I think this is fine. The U.S. and the next issue is about the U.S. and Russia agreeing to extend non-proliferation and nuclear weapons treaties, which obviously is a good thing. I don't see how anyone could argue with that. I think one of the great losses of the past decade is how a lot of that, we've seen, the intermediate missile treaty and other treaties kind of falling by the wayside and really increasing global insecurity because of the strained relationship between the United States and Russia. That needs to be reversed. I mean, we don't want to see a nuclear war. I think that's kind of been the point here, hasn't it? Ukraine commits in point 18 to be a non-nuclear state in accordance with the NPT, Non-Proliferation Treaty. I don't see Ukraine getting nuclear weapons in any case. So I don't think that's an issue. The Zaporizhzhia power plant would be shared by Ukraine and Russia. To me, that is that's something that Russia should be willing to give up on. If there's to be negotiations, the idea is that Zaporizhzhia would provide the energy 50, would split its energy output 50-50 between Russia and Ukraine. I see that as unnecessary. Yes, it will help lower Russian energy prices, but it won't be that significant for Russia. It'll be much more significant for Ukraine, given its battered infrastructure. And I think that if there's negotiations to be, I'm not even sure why they felt the need to put this in here, but if there's negotiations to be done, that should be a place that Russia can make concessions and should. And if it refuses to, I think that does throw into question whether or not Russia's sincere about even dealing with this and addressing this proposal. Point 20 is about, educational programs to promote tolerance and understanding of another culture, blah, blah, blah. Um, I don't, you know, it, it's pro forma language in most of it, in terms of, abolish discriminatory measures, guarantee the rights of both Ukrainians and Russians, blah, blah, blah. The only thing is the last point that is made here is that all Nazi ideology and activities must be rejected and prohibited. And unfortunately, um, that needs fleshing out. You want to say all Nazi ideology, fine, but you have to say what that means, because otherwise it can be used as an excuse to claim violations that may be contentious. That you say, well, first of all, the Russian propaganda about basically Nazis controlling Ukraine is false. There are neo-Nazi groups in Ukraine. There are neo-Nazi groups in Russia. There are neo-Nazi groups in the United States and throughout Europe. There's groups that could be fairly called Nazi that don't necessarily label themselves that way. It's vague language, and vague language in these kinds of agreements needs to be ejected and broken down and specified. What is it that you're talking about here? Are you talking about racism? I mean, are we really, going to say, in a country where the Coast Guard today was reported to have said that nooses and Nazi swastikas are are no longer considered hate symbols in the Coast Guard, but just potentially divisive? That we're going to be lecturing the rest of the world about racism? It's absurd. This needs to be more specific. Point 21 is territories, which we've discussed, I think, a good deal already. Basically, the Donbass becomes Russian. Basically, the rest of the territory is divided by where the lines are right now. So other than the fact that Ukraine has to sacrifice the rest of the Donbass, there doesn't seem to be much new here. Point 22 is that after agreeing on territorial arrangements, Russia and Ukraine undertake not to change these arrangements by force. Any security guarantees will not apply in the event of a breach of this commitment, which is basically a repeat of what's already been stated. 23 is Russia will not prevent Ukraine from using the Dnieper River for commercial activities, and agreements will be reached on the free transport of grain across the Black Sea. That's good. No, that's fine. 24, a humanitarian committee will be established to resolve outstanding issues, prisoners and bodies being exchanged, hostages and detainees, including children. That is specified here, and I think that's really important because of the practice of Russia kidnapping Ukrainian children and bringing them to basically be raised as Russian children. Is about as horrifying an aspect of this war as any. And the fact that that is at least alluded to here, I think, is important. It says that a family reunification program will be implemented. That's all great. It's exactly the kind of thing that in an agreement like this falls by the wayside. So it's something that will need to be monitored, but it's good that it's there. 25 is that Ukraine will hold elections in 100 days, which, I mean, Ukraine, when the war is over, Ukraine needs to have elections anyway. Zelensky's term has been extended because of the war, but it expired a long time ago. So, so that should happen. And, I'm sure people will read this as, saying, this is Moscow's way of getting Zelensky out because they hate Zelensky. And Trump would certainly go along with that because he obviously doesn't like Zelensky much either. But those elections need to happen. And there's nothing in here that bars anybody from running. So, um, all number 26, and this was what I alluded to earlier. All parties involved in this conflict will receive full amnesty for their actions during the war and agree not to make any claims or consider any complaints in the future. In other words, there will be no accountability. This is, I mean, this is an issue that goes far beyond Russia and Ukraine. It is the new world order. You know, leaders can do whatever they want. They do not face accountability, and that is intentional. It is declared. When George Bush launched his illegal invasion of Iraq, because of some connection to 9/11 that he damn well knew did not exist, because of weapons of mass destructions that he knew did not exist. Barack Obama came in after him and said, "Well, we're going to ignore all of that. We're going to ignore the war crimes of George W. Bush, of Dick Cheney, of Donald Rumsfeld, et cetera, and just move on." Well, that's what led us to Trump. So, this is what needs to be changed. But this provision of it here is no worse than many, many provisions of it all around the world. Number 27 is that the agreement will be legally binding, and that the implementation will be monitored and guaranteed by the Peace Council headed by Trump. Sanctions will be imposed for violations. So this is much like the Board of Peace in the Gaza Agreement, and opens the door for all kinds of Trump's personal dirty dealings and, arbitrary decisions on all kinds of cases. So this should be scary to anyone, but it's almost a given with Trump that something like this is going to be here. And then number 28 is that the ceasefire would take effect immediately when everyone agrees. So, as I said at the outset, I expected something worse than this. This is in some ways at least somewhat better than the Gaza plan. Of course, the circumstances are very different, because this really is talking about an end to the war. It is the terms may not be great, but it does talk about putting an end to everything and having Ukraine move on in independence, which is not what's happening, and not what Trump envisions for the Gaza Strip. So it's different in that regard. So the circumstances are simply different. But there may not be a better deal, frankly, for Ukraine. I mean, I think there are things that Ukraine can do to improve this deal. And I think that Ukraine can do a lot to ensure that, that I think Ukraine as well has already done a lot to ensure that Russia would think twice before doing this again. The fact of the matter is, this has not gone anything like the way Vladimir Putin expected it to. As I said, they failed in their objective, and you can look at this even with these concessions, which are painful and horrible and unfair and unjust. But even with them, I think you can look at this whole thing as a win for Ukraine, because they withstood a much more powerful army and kept their government intact for what's about to turn into 4 years, under sustained attack, and it could go on. And that's both the problem, but also a sign of how well Ukraine has done given the hand that they were dealt. But 4 years ago, a lot of this could have been avoided. And because Joe Biden and Boris Johnson were able to convince Zelensky that he could do better, that he could recapture, it was at that point that Zelensky changed his tune on all of this and said, that the goal was to recapture everything that Russia had taken, and that they convinced him that that was possible, even though they weren't going to put any boots on the ground to help him. And that was an absurd contention that unfortunately too many people here in the United States waving Ukrainian flags backed, even though it was the worst thing that Ukraine could have done at that point. And it's led, as I warned it would back then, to the much greater losses that Ukraine is going to have to swallow now. And if they do pass this up, I'm afraid that in a year or 2 years, whenever something else may come up, the concessions they're going to have to give are going to be even bigger. So on the whole, this is a bad deal for Ukraine, but it's a much better deal than continuing the war because it ain't going to get better than this. And that's what the lesson should have been taken away from 4 years ago. And I think also, let's foresee where this goes. Is this proposal really one that Moscow's okay with? I don't think that's a given. Just because this was worked out with them doesn't mean that once it's public, it is discussed by more people have input, that Moscow won't say, you know what, this really is not good enough for us to stop our aggression. And we're going to also see the fact, how Zelensky responds. I frankly, at the outset of this, when I first heard about the outline of what was being demanded, which is territorial concessions, limits on the military, on Ukraine's military, and no NATO in exchange for ending the war where things stand now. I had to feel that Zelensky, to even consider it, must have been under tremendous pressure and is just afraid to just outright reject something from Trump. And maybe that is the case. But again, I'm not sure how much of a better uh, deal he can hope for, unless the United States is willing to impose something on Russia, which I don't think it even has the power to do. But even if it did, I certainly don't see Trump doing. So, um, bad deal. War is terrible, and we've already lost the concept of, the basic fundamental concept of the United Nations, that the acquisition of territory by force is inadmissible and unacceptable. That's gone here. And there really isn't anything to do about it unless, again, NATO as a whole wants to join in the war directly. And that has never been an option. So given that, I hope that Zelensky can negotiate a better deal than this one, but that, he's willing to more or less work within this framework. And I know that's something that a lot of people aren't going to like, but I don't see a better path. And I think it is naive to think that continued fighting is somehow, this time, where it hasn't for the past 4 years, going to benefit Ukraine. So leave it there. Love to hear your feedback, and you can go and look at some of the other videos here on this channel. Appreciate your support, and I will talk to you soon.